Let's test cheap versus expensive helmets. An expensive one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive football boots. An expensive one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive mini blenders. An expensive one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive sports bras. Expensive one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive frying pan. Expensive performs slightly better on the copper scratch test. Now for a heat test. Cheap gets hotter quicker, but expensive stays hotter for much longer. Now for a non-stick test. Again, expensive performs very slightly better. I'd say the most important test we did today was the temperature heat test. What we saw was the cheap one got hot extremely quickly, and it took a slightly longer time for the expensive to get warm. The heat retention in the expensive was so much better, it stayed hotter for way longer. What you'll find with the cheap is that you're only at the optimal cooking temperature for a very short period of time. Either you're going right through it and it's too hot, or you're going too low and it's too cold. So is it worth the price tag? I'm inclined to say yeah. Expensive one, very cool. Let's test the cheap and expensive super glue. Comment who you think will win. It's another draw. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive wire strippers. Expensive wins because of the extra function. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive fluffy rollers. An expensive one. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive chocolate. First, let's look at a hot water melt test. Much more even from expensive. These have been mixed up. Don't know which is which, so let's start on this side. Okay, good smell. Is that it? So straight away, one of these is better than the other. The richness in flavour on the second one was just so good. Hot water melt test you saw earlier is really interesting because it creates a sort of much more even coating in the mouth. The first one did melt in my mouth, but it just wasn't quite the same in the way that it coated my tongue. It was much more uneven. An expensive one, very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive Christmas chocolate. A cheap one, very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive shop vacs. And cheap is the winner. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive cola. Cheap has a much lighter colour. Now let's do a blind taste test. On this side first, if I can find it. Okay, here it is. Okay, let's see. Let's try the other one and then we'll compare them afterwards. Okay, that makes a lot of sense now. The second one wasn't as sweet as the first one, but the sweetness kind of hit a further place in my mouth. It's interesting. They both taste really similar, but I definitely think I prefer the second one. Expensive wins. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive earphones. Starting with the comfort test. Cheap wins with more even force. Cheap wins battery life with 8 hours. Next, sound leakage. 4 for expensive. Only 1 for cheap. So I'm sat here now with one in each ear. I can tell you that the AirPod definitely has a rounder, fuller sound to it. There's almost a tinny quality to the cheap one. It's definitely as loud as the AirPod. So AirPods definitely win on sound quality. Cheap wins overall. Very cool.